So this morning, we're diving straight into a brand new series, asking the question, who is the greatest? We're going to do that by looking at the book of Hebrews, a book in itself that is a great piece of New Testament theology. We're going to be looking in detail at Hebrews chapter 1 today, so I do invite you to grab a Bible, either from the basket or pull out your smartphone and use whatever biblical app you use most often. And we're going to listen to the words first from Hebrews chapter 1. If you are using a Pew Bible, it's towards the back, page 1201. Hebrews chapter 1. In the past, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed as heir of all things, and through whom he made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things through his powerful words. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. So he became as much superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is superior to theirs. For to which of the angels did God ever say, "You are my son, today I have become your father"? Or again, "I will be his father and he will be my son"? And again, when God brings his firstborn into the world, he says, "Let all the angels worship him." In speaking of angels, he says, he makes his angel wings, his servants flames of fire. But about the Son, he says, "Your throne, O God, will last forever and ever. Your righteousness will be the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has set you above your companions by anointing you with the oil of joy." He also says, "In the beginning, O Lord, you laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands, and they will perish, but you will remain. They will all wear out like a garment. You will roll them up like a robe. Like a garment, they will be changed, but you remain the same, and yours will never end." And to which of the angels did God ever say, "Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet"? Are not all angels ministering spirits sent to serve those who will inherit salvation? I'm really excited about this new series, The Greatest. I invite you, it is a textual series, an expository series, so I do invite you to keep your Bibles open, and we'll be diving directly into the text about halfway through what I'm going to say. I'm going to talk for about half an hour, so if you do want to make notes along the way, I really believe that if we're attentive to what God is saying to us in our thoughts and our minds, maybe through my words, there will be things for us to take into the next week. So if you do want to take notes, either stuff that I say or stuff that I disagree with, please feel free to do that and to take it away with you for the rest of the week. This morning, I want to get us warmed up a little bit for this series, and so I'm going to try and do three things. As I've said, the book of Hebrews is considered to be amongst the highest pieces, the greatest pieces of New Testament theology we have available to us. It's considered by scholars to be one of our key texts in understanding the nature of God. In this book, we're going to hear about what makes Jesus the greatest and why we are invited to take our part in that story too. And so I'm going to try and give us a little bit of context into this greatest piece of work. Secondly, we're going to look at that first part of chapter 1, where it talks about Jesus being greater than the angels. And then we'll spend a little bit of time in the second half of chapter 1, where Jesus is greater than, well, everything else. I'm sure it's accidental, but I love the fact that I get to preach on Hebrews chapter 1 on the day of the London Marathon. when I'm not here and the church I currently work at is in the centre of Westminster. And I love Westminster on Marathon Day because I get escorted across the road. I love Westminster on Marathon Day because it is awash with colour and banners and face paints and noise, sometimes on the faces of runners, but most of the time on the sidelines with the thousands and thousands of people that have come out to support that 330,000 athletes. I love that on Marathon Day, the streets of Westminster are so full of noise. There's loudspeakers. You end up cheering for strangers by their first names, which are scribbled on the front of their vests as they run past. I love Marathon Day because although the Brownlee brothers got the headlines, Marathon Day is where you pick up the person that's struggling and make sure they get across the finish line. I love London on Marathon Day because London on Marathon Day is the greatest marathon in the world. I love Marathon Day because most of the time when I'm not cheering on the sidelines, I'm sat crying into my cornflakes, listening to the stories of why people are running. My two favourites from this morning. The oldest runner is 83 years old, nearly 84 years old. This is his 37th marathon. He started running probably then in his 40s or early 50s. 37th marathon. His fastest time was just over 2 hours. Today, he's aiming to finish in about 6. My second favourite comment from the day, a kind of dedication that was read out by Claire Balding, just raises more questions. It said this: to Richard Walker, riding Geoffrey the ostrich in memory of his wife Lydia. Love it. You see, on Marathon Day, it doesn't matter who's running. It matters what you're running for. The survivor, the sufferer, the victim, the hero, the veteran, the countless thousands supported by famous NGOs, or the whispered forgotten name of a close family member. What matters is the story. What matters is who you're running for. The London Marathon is the greatest marathon in the world. And it's not just because of all those amazing landmarks that are followed. It's because of the London Marathon I knew where the Cutty Sock was, after all. But it's because of the history and the story woven into the fabric of this event. It doesn't really matter who wins, but go David Weir. What matters is that we're all runners, whether we're sat on the sidelines weeping into our cornflakes or taking part in the greatest show on earth. And this matters in the book of Hebrews. I promise it links. Because the book of Hebrews offers us a similar invitation. An invitation to take part in the biggest and greatest story in history. It's one of the greatest pieces of theology because it invites us to take part in Jesus' life. It asks the question, who are you running for? Whose story are you telling with your life? And the book of Hebrews offers questions and practical ways by which you can live out a flourishing way of following Jesus. The book of Hebrews offers us an understanding of the nature of God through Jesus, the greatest. In the next few weeks, you're going to hear sermons that will provide evidence about this man, Jesus, this God-man, Christ. We're going to hear sophisticated and nuanced language and poetry which attempts to unpick what is going on in very sophisticated Jewish beliefs. No pressure there, Jason. We're going to hear ways in which Jesus' life intersects with Jewish practices. Why is Jesus the greatest Jew, the promised Messiah? We're going to hear language of covenant and promise and priesthood, angels and sacrifice, fear, hope, love wins. We're going to hear about a great cloud of witnesses cheering us on to the very finish line, whether it's on heavenly street corners or merely down the mall. And just like the London Marathon, I also promise that some of this sermon series is going to feel really hard work. Some of this series is going to feel like a really difficult slog through stuff that you really don't want to be there for. And so I hope that you're able to take away from what I'm saying the bigger picture. Why does it matter? It matters because who are you running for? It matters because you're involved in this ginormous, greatest story on earth. Focus on the greatest when you hit the wall and the going gets tough. But just in case that moment happens today, I have one further treat. Because as for all runners, when you hit the wall, you need a jelly baby or 3. So whether you need them already, if you're exhausted already, or whether you need them as we go, please hold on to what you need and enjoy your jelly babies. The London Marathon is an important metaphor in another way too. You remember I said it doesn't matter who's running. Well, we don't actually know who wrote the book of Hebrews. Early scholars thought that it might have been written by Paul, and they put it alongside Galatians and Ephesians and Romans and the letters to the Corinthians. But in studying the text a little more, in noticing the language and the use of poetry and the deeper imagery, scholars became unsure whether that was the case, and now it's widely believed that it wasn't one of Paul's letters. It was probably written at about the same time, but not by Paul himself, which opens up the question, so who wrote it? Most scholarship at the moment is willing to contemplate it was written by one of the first Jewish Christian evangelists, a lady called Priscilla. And as with much of society, women talking about God is not a popular thing to admit to. And so it's hidden its authorship so that the letter itself continues to have prominence and influence throughout history. But it doesn't matter who you're running or who's running. It matters who you're running for. Partly because of this difficulty with authorship, the book of Hebrews was one of a few hokey-cokey texts. They were in and out of the Gospels a little bit. But it's now, through a long process of prayer and discernment, considered to not only be canonical, but to be one of the greatest pieces of theology, exploring the nature of God through Christ that we can have available to us. It doesn't matter who's running, but what they're running for. Hebrews is a book written to a small group of struggling Jewish Christians. They were at risk of reverting back to the old practices that they knew. They were disillusioned, doubt-filled Christians, leaning on ritual, the ancient stories of the past, rather than living into this new Christian identity. They'd lost confidence in the transformative power of Jesus' resurrection. They were doubting whether love wins at all. And they were constantly living in fear. They were fearful of being found out as charlatans by other Jewish Christians because they weren't doing things right by their standards. And they were scared of being found out by the Jewish authorities and thus persecuted. This book is written to a really complicated small group of broken people. One theologian, a guy called Anthony Thistleton, has said this: in place of boldness, pilgrimage, and self-discipline, this group have relapsed into a cozy, protective mindset of maintenance at the expense of mission. They have tamed and domesticated the gospel into a safe religion. Can you see why I'm excited about hearing about Hebrews in this current contemporary climate? In a world where, in the last few weeks, the church seems to have had greater ability in talking about chocolate than chemical warfare, where we have so many questions that it's difficult to find any answers, in a world where love really doesn't win all that often, where it's easier to be cozy in a mode of maintenance, to have a domesticated gospel rather than a risky, give an inch, see God shake the world sort of mission. This book about the greatest in our midst, will be a book that will shape us as a church and will shape a nation at this really crucial time. And so I want us to spend the rest of our time this morning engaging in the text itself. So at this point, if you do want to pull out phones or the Bible, we're going to look at the text in detail. A friend of mine used to be a senior manager at Royal Mail, and one of the departments he oversaw was the fraud department. His favourite question was always, how do you spot a fake £1 coin? Until last month, 1 in 40 pound coins were counterfeits. It's about 3% of the pound coins in circulation were fraudulent. How do you spot a fake pound coin? His answer? You don't spot a fake pound coin. You notice the real thing. You don't notice a fake pound coin. You know what the real thing looks like. And this is important for us because in verse 3, we have the statement that the Son, Jesus, is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. And the Greek word that is translated there as exact representation is the Greek word character. It's where we get the word character from. It's that internal beingness, the stuff that makes us who we are. It literally means the impression left on a seal of a coin, the impression, the representation, the reproduction made on a coin. It signifies an exact correspondence between the impression and the original seal. Thus, the Son Jesus is the perfect imprint of the very being of God. You don't spot a fake coin. You know the real thing. Later on in Hebrews, we're going to hear ways in which Jesus is the greatest human in history. But here, right at the start, in this poetic introduction where the writer is just getting warmed up, we hear how Jesus is the exact representation of God the divine. Here, this brilliant masterpiece of theology sets the record straight on Jesus' divinity. As Jimmy Dunn has noted, Jesus the Son reveals who God is, reflects and radiates his very nature, glory and grace. And because of this, then is active in our world and performs God's work. In this very state of character fullness, of representation, of divine likeness, Jesus is then able to sustain, to bear all things. Love wins. Jesus brings everything back into its created cosmic order. I love then that the rest of this early passage in Hebrews chapter 1 becomes a little bit light-footed. It's conversational. It reads a little bit like banter. I kind of imagine it like the warm-up in a boxing ring. You're kind of getting ready for the argument and you're kind of giving one or two little nips and tweaks as you go. You're kind of being a little light on your foot. What's going on here is that the writer is using ancient texts to begin to build the argument that Jesus is the greatest. The people that have produced your pre-Bibles knew this and have given you footnotes to help to prove what's going on in this little kind of give and take of the arguments. You see, the Jewish Christian audience would know these references. They would be recited in their hymns and in their storytelling and around their Passover tables. These are the texts that they've been looking for the fulfillment of for centuries. And the writer is saying, Jesus is the greatest. Jesus is who you've been waiting for. Jesus is the story to whom you're to live into. And Jesus is the greatest because God never said these things of angels, but God said these things of Christ. And so we begin on this building boxing match. You are my son. Today I have become your father was never said of the angels, but it was said of Jesus at his baptism. You are my son, my beloved, in whom I am well pleased. In Old Testament terms, the angels are called sons of God. But that's using a different word, a word about adoption into a household, about being part of the family, not a strict biology. This isn't a character exact representation that is, you're on our team. It's only Jesus who is the Son of the Father. Secondly, we move on. I will be his father and he will be my son. This refers back to an ancient text in 2 Samuel where the prophet Nathan is talking to the royal King David and saying, David, mate, my translation, the Messiah will come through your lineage. The Messiah will come through the kings of Israel, but it's not going to come through your son Solomon. And Solomon was a great king. He was a bit of a fickle king. He made loads of mistakes. He did some really great stuff. But Nathan the prophet is saying here in 2 Samuel that actually Solomon was not the Messiah, but one who was coming would be. This royal, monarchical, regal fulfillment. Jesus is greater than any of the kings of Israel because it's through Jesus that salvation is found, not through any other king or leader. You know the real thing, not the counterfeit. And then we move on. Let all the angels worship him, which they do at Jesus' birth. The angels in Luke chapter 2 sing, choirs of angels, glory to God in the highest. Blessed be he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna, glory in the highest, peace on earth to all people. And then he makes angel spirits and servants flames of fire. Taken from Psalm 104, a psalm which talks of God creating the world and the angels putting God's command into practice. It's God who has the imagination for the whole of creation, and it's the angels, the servants' flames of fire, who put this into action. Yes, the angels are higher than humanity, but Jesus is higher still. And we move on, verses 8 and 9. Not only are the angels merely servants of God's will, but they're also servants of the King who metes out justice. And so we have another kingly, royal, monarchical image of Jesus sat on the right hand of the Father, his scepter of justice in hand, offering salvation to those who name him. There is leadership here. The angels do the bidding of God, but Jesus is the one who wields a scepter. You know a counterfeit because you know the real thing. So time after time after time, the writer here is saying that Jesus is greater than the angels. You know all of these things that have been said about Jesus. They prove what's been said in the past. Jesus is the greatest. Jesus is the one that you're waiting for. Jesus is God's recovery plan for his people. And yet, if you've not yet eaten your jelly baby, you might want to because it gets bigger. God's recovery plan for humanity is not just for the Hebrew people. It's not just for the whole of humanity. But here, God's salvation plan is for the whole universe. Brian Cox, watch out. In verses 10 to 12, we have this beautiful poetic refrain on the nature of the heavens, the universe, and their relationship to God, their creator. In Psalm 8, we're told that God creates the world at the tips of his fingers. The Christian and Hebrew creation story is not one of wielding power and might and strength. It's not an act of great force. Our creative God does so with the dexterity of God's fingertips. There is beauty and delicacy and generosity and grace. This isn't a mighty act of a powerful God. This is the delicate act of a gracious God. And in Psalm 102, the writer says that even such a beautiful, generous, gracious, delicate act can be folded away like a cloak, like a worn out, threadbare cloak. When I was very small, my brother, who was smaller than me, he isn't anymore, had a blue woolen blanket. It's comfort blanket. But it wasn't a blanket that was important to him. He spent his entire early childhood plucking the blue wool from his blue blanket and putting it alongside the side of his nose. His comfort was this small ball of wool. Wherever he went, you would find streams and streams of these small pieces of blue wool everywhere. In fact, my grandma, who'd moved 3 times by the point she died, was convinced she was still finding pieces of blue wool 15 to 20 years later. I say this because sometimes we do look after our threadbare, beautiful, well-loved items. We keep them and put them away for wedding banquets and storytelling. This is important because these verses are used often by some parts of Christianity to suggest that actually we don't need to take care of creation. That climate change is just one way in which we can speed up this process of creation being folded away and God's new creation coming to fulfillment. And I want to say that's not what this text says. This text says that Jesus is greater than creation. That Jesus is not obsolete, is not threadbare, will not wear out. Jesus is ever present and ongoing, not outdated or to be thrown away. But that our creation still matters because Jesus is an integral part of that. Our care of creation is vital because it speaks to a God of generosity and delicacy and grace, who is using us to live out his story. And at the end of times, when it is lovingly folded like a cloak and rolled away, the wedding banquet is laid out. And there will be a new heaven and a new earth. But Jesus remains. Yesterday, the same and forever. Jesus, unlike the whole of the universe, is not outdated nor obsolete. And we know that because at the beginning and the end of the passage that we're hearing about today, Jesus sits at God's right hand, literally God's right hand man, given that place of ultimate honor, never to be equaled, greater throughout the whole of creation, the whole cosmos, the whole spiritual realm. You know a counterfeit because you know the real thing sitting in the place of honor. And so this morning, I hope I've whetted your appetite a little bit for this book of Hebrews. We've seen it as one of the greatest theological texts in the New Testament. We've seen that Jesus is greater than the angels, fulfilling prophecy, and is even greater than creation. We've seen Jesus invites us to take part in a story. It's not who's running, but who they're running for. It's the story that matters. And we are invited into this narrative that love wins in a culture of disillusionment, fear, and low confidence. We've had jelly babies to help spur us on when this series seems a little bit like a difficult marathon. But we know a counterfeit because we know Jesus is the real thing, not obsolete, never to be worn out. Jesus is the greatest. And so, as we will hear towards the end of our series, let us throw off everything that hinders us. The sin that entangles us, let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and the perfecter of our faith. As we start a series about the greatest, what is it that you need to throw off? What is it that you need in order to run the race marked out for you? A Jesus following, love wins life with perseverance and confidence that Jesus is indeed the greatest.